Hello, welcome back to Your Story Stinks. This is episode 3 where we're talking about Harry Potter. Or more accurately, we're going to be talking about J.K. Rowling and why she's not a very good writer. Last time we talked about the first 100 issues of Spawn, and Spawn is a complex and hard thing to articulate as to why it's bad because it's all over the place. J.K. Rowling's much easier. J.K. Rowling, her writing and the reason why her writing is bad and the reason why she has so many problems now are all from mostly the same thing. We're going to get into that. But before we do that, we need to make sure that everybody knows that the transphobia is not the only problem. In fact, I don't even think it's the core problem. It is a symptom of a wider problem of her writing and her as a person. And we're going to get into that. So, let's start off fairly simple. That's a question. J.K. Rowling spends a lot of time in the news, doesn't she? And look, there's just a lot of digital ink spilled already about what kind of person she is and whether you can still like her books or whether or not liking what she wrote is some kind of indication of what kind of person you are. And to me, none of these debates hold very much worth because they're not really about her or her creations as much as they are about people who consume them and how they view themselves, which means that they're debates being had by consumers for consumers about other consumers. The actual works themselves are kind of an afterthought in those debates. So instead of doing that, we're going to focus on the works themselves, and more importantly, I'm trying to explain why things like her transphobia are indicative of why her creation hasn't really much evolved, as it has kind of slumped from one bad idea to the next and continued time after time to reveal all of her weaknesses rather than her strengths. Now, it's worth mentioning as we start out, because we're not going to spend very much time on it, that she does have strengths as a writer. I know, that's kind of shocking if you're only being introduced to her works now, but her works wouldn't have gotten as big as they did if she didn't have strengths as a writer. So let's examine these. So what is Harry Potter? In the most general sense, Harry Potter is a highly focused story about a boy discovering he's a wizard, dealing with forces beyond his control, and becoming an adult, while also accepting a responsibility that he didn't ask for. And so along the way, he makes friends and allies, and we, as the audience, witness not just change in him, but change in the world around him, as the old world dies and a new world is born. The Wizarding War is very much a transitioning point, not just for the characters, but for the world that they inhabit. It's a moment where the forces that define the last generation are finally defeated, and the new generation steps up and takes the lead. This is, in fact, literal, as well as figurative. Voldemort is literally the enemy many of the protagonist's parents fought, and he's literally returned from the dead in a last-ditch effort to take over the world. So, having said all that, why is it that the whole thing falls apart outside of the main books, and why is it that she's incapable of expanding upon what she's already created? That's the question we need to ask, and it's the question I'm going to answer. So, let's begin with the most important reason that Harry Potter manages to succeed as a story. It's highly focused. Now, the story is about one boy, Harry, and his adventures. There are other characters, lots of other characters, but the story is predominantly about him, and new information is only introduced as it becomes relevant to his story. We, the audience, experience the world through his eyes. We become aware of things at the same time as he does. Now, this means that there are lots of things that do not need to be overly explained. We can accept them, as Harry does, with minimal explanation, content that things work because they just do. So, for example, when it's revealed that people travel from place to place through fireplaces, we don't need a detailed explanation as to how this is possible. Okay, they say it's possible, it's treated as being true, and thus we can accept that it is true that people can move through fireplaces. That's all you need. Many things can be introduced with the same lack of detail as they're needed. So, for example, the Chamber of Secrets exists. How it fits into the actual makeup of the castle isn't really important because the castle isn't real. It's not a real physical place in the real world. It can be whatever size or shape as the story needs it to be. No one is asking anyone to draw up physical floor plans for the thing, because this level of detail isn't required for the story. Now, beyond that, there's the matter of world building, of which there is decidedly little in the actual books, because it's not needed. The culture and world of Harry Potter around him is fleshed out, but the wider world of Harry Potter isn't, because the wider world is not important to the story. Harry Potter is not a story about the world of Harry Potter. It is a story about a boy in England doing things in England. The most we see of the rest of the world comes in like small snippets, individuals from other schools and other countries, or Quidditch teams, or excerpts of the Weasleys on vacation. Little bits that don't really require a whole lot of fleshing out, because ultimately they're not really important to the story. For example, what sort of place Germany is in the Harry Potter world isn't relevant because the story doesn't take place there. Now, on that note, there's the matter of how close the story is to Rowling herself. Rowling, unsurprisingly, is English, and surprise, surprise, she writes about people living in England during a time that she herself lived, which for most people is fairly easy. She doesn't need to work too hard to make parts fit together because she takes what she already knows and expands upon it. Writing what you know is honestly one of the most basic rules for writing fiction. So when she writes about kids going to school in the 90s, she's writing from personal experience and is using that to tell a story and add a level of believability to it. So, where does this all go wrong? So first and foremost, the cracks all begin to show in the later books because Rowling has to expand the scope and raise the stakes of what she's writing. Fundamentally, she is out of her depth as she's forced to move beyond the realm of children at school dealing with magical problems. When she has to handle things like politics, something she knows very little about, she begins to flounder and the questions in the mind of the reader become greater in number. Now, I have a rule when it comes to writing that applies across the board. The bigger your scope, the bigger your problems. Essentially, as the story gets larger, more things are drawn into it. More people in higher positions of power are involved, and things move from the personal realm to the geopolitical realm. So, for example, things move from a school to the whole of England, possibly Europe, and that raises lots and lots of questions that Rowling herself isn't prepared to answer. So, in many cases, she just doesn't need to answer them because the story isn't about the answers to those questions. What France or Germany or the US or anyone else thinks or wants to do about the pending magical civil war in England isn't really important to the story that's focused on Harry. But that's also why her ability to do anything with her world falls apart as soon as it moves beyond Harry himself, because Harry Potter is not a world so much as it is a setting. The world only matters when Harry or someone important to the plot encounters it. It's neither meant to be nor intended to be a living, breathing entity all of its own. Now that doesn't mean it couldn't be, but it's here where we run into Rowling's biggest issue, which is that she's fundamentally uncurious about the world and the people in it, and she's very dismissive of things she doesn't personally like. And this is where things like her transphobia come into play, and yes, see, I told you we'd get there. So, as I said, Rowling is at her best when she writes about times and places she personally identifies with, namely the 90s. But it goes without saying that 2022 is not 1992, culturally or otherwise. A lot has changed in 30 years, and Rowling herself looks upon the world with a sense of alienation and disgust in equal measure. For Rowling, trans people aren't personally offensive in that she doesn't have any kind of personal grudge against them as individuals. What bothers her is that acceptance of them clashes with how she feels things should be, and because they don't meet her idea of what things should be, they must be bad. Thus, in her mind, trans people are a deviation from the norm and thus evil. Now, some people would say I'm providing a moral framework for understanding her bigotry that she herself wouldn't recognize, but the reason why this framework matters is because once you understand it, you see it everywhere in her writing. Now, Rowling, as I said, is incurious about the world and often makes wide assumptions about it and gets personally offended when things don't match those assumptions. This isn't really actually unique to her. Many people look out into the world and expect to find a mirror. Like, they view the world and its problems through the lens of their own experiences. But as a writer, this sort of thinking is extremely harmful, because the world is not some uniform mass, but a conglomeration of lots of different ideas, cultures, and standards of morality. So when it comes time to write about, say, the United States, she writes at the perspective of what she assumes it was like, rather than actually trying to make it feel real. Now, lots of people say that she's gotten lazy, but that's not really true because she's always been lazy. But the thing is, it wasn't noticeable because she was writing in a time and a place that she already knew about, and so she didn't really need to do any extra work to make it feel real. Now, it's worth noting that in the first book, The Sorcerer's Stone, it was published in 1997, the same year that Harry Potter graduated from the school in-universe. So Rowling is writing at the same time that the books are taking place, which is often lost on people who consume the media like 20 years later. It's why her foray into other time periods and things like Fantastic Beasts don't work, because she doesn't know anything about American culture now, let alone in the period she's writing in, and because of this, everything feels wrong and often laughable from the standpoint of an American. So, for example, if you know nothing about America or Americans, the idea that there would be a national organization that exerted near total control over people decades before the CIA came into existence might seem somewhat rational. After all, in Europe, there's a long history of top-down rule. But if you're an American, this is nonsense, because it doesn't fit the American character or the American experience. So, the idea that people would draw their entire ideology from the Salem witch trials only makes sense if you know nothing about how America became America or the issues it's faced and dealt with. And much of this is because Rowling, being incurious, assumes that the US is exactly like Britain, a nation whose conquests were all far away and who attempted to remain mostly culturally homogenous. But the US isn't anything like that. The US expansion westward meant constant conflict and contact with people not like themselves, to say nothing of how much land was traded between various European powers. And of course, that's also without mentioning the influx of immigrants into the country. And all of that doesn't even mention slavery, or how it shaped the US and how people in America thought. So for something like Rowling, and for much of the British public, things like the slave trade are things that happened elsewhere. But for Americans, that's a core part of our national history. It's the issue which caused the Civil War, and it wasn't until much later that people of color were granted civil rights. So as you can imagine, Rowling trying to write about pre-civil rights era America from the perspective that its entire identity was shaped by Puritan witches in Salem when much of the country was settled by people from vastly different parts of the world is like watching a child trying to construct a map of the universe. Like, it's baffling and it's a little sad. But actually, while we're on the topic of Fantastic Beasts, let's talk another reason about why the movies don't work, which is Rowling is not a screenwriter. Now, one thing that a lot of non-writers might not realize is that there are different skill sets for different kinds of fiction. So the skills that make a good novelist do not make for a good poet, and neither of those skill sets make for good screenwriters. So here's the thing, when Rowling was overseeing the books becoming movies, she had other people to take what she'd already written and translate that onto the screen. She didn't need to think visually, because she just needed to see if whatever she was being shown fit what she imagined. This is fundamentally different from trying to start to write a screenplay from scratch. Doing that means you have to understand how to set a scene, how to think in terms of both sound and image. This requires both for the screenwriter to relinquish control and to take control of a great many more things. So here's an example. When you write a novel, the writer is essentially God. They have full control over what the audience sees and how they see it. There's no misunderstanding emotions because the author tells you how things should be interpreted. Movies are not like this. Actors and directors can fundamentally change how scenes and characters are interpreted based entirely on body language and how they deliver their lines. And that's without even beginning to talk about the fact that editing and the way in which editing is a science as much as an art form affects the medium as a whole. And that is without mentioning the audience. Now, as I said a moment ago, the writer is essentially a god when it comes to controlling how things are interpreted when we're talking about novels. If a person is meant to be evil or seen in a negative light, they can make that clear through their writing. The audience only has a single perspective to see things in, and that's the one of the author. But as we've seen countless times, audiences will often rally behind characters that do awful, horrible things. Take for example the fact that there are people out there who think that the main characters of series like Mad Men and Breaking Bad and Fight Club are not just sympathetic, but aspirational. So look at how audiences turn characters like Loki, a villain who wants to enslave the Earth in Avengers, into a hero in his own series because of how popular he was. Look at how audiences will rally around characters like Wanda Maximoff in WandaVision, despite the fact that she brainwashes an entire town full of people who then beg her for death rather than be mind-controlled by her any longer. Audiences, simply put, do not do what writers want, and many just consume content uncritically. So it should be more than apparent by now that Rowling is a bit of a control freak, and she dislikes when people don't agree with her, as her transphobia obviously shows. The idea that people might disagree with her meaning, or even misunderstand it entirely, is maddening to someone like Rowling, and as a result, she constantly doubles down on bad decisions, refusing outright to adapt from critique and bring in new ideas. And again, we have to go back to that rule again. The bigger the scope of the world, the bigger your problems are. Rowling never bothered to think about things like magic in other countries. She's never considered how other countries even work. There's a rather comical map that she made showing different magical schools across the world, and it does things like group India, China, and Japan all under one school, which makes up almost half the world's population. To Rowling, a map is a picture to be colored in. It's not a thing denoting anything as important as cultural or national identity. In Rowling's world, everything is the same because she's never bothered to consider what it must be like not to live the way she has. Now, keep in mind, no one has ever actually asked her to write things she doesn't know. No one was like, we need you to write movies set in 1920s America. You know, it would have been entirely fine if she wrote more stories in modern-day Britain, or even the time before Harry Potter. But I think Rowling is fundamentally incapable of this, because again, the time before or after when she's written doesn't conform to her personal or cultural identity. So she can't write about things in the present because things like transgenderism is increasingly accepted, and writing about kids in 2020 would make her seem old, out of touch, and bigoted, which are all things that accurately describe her. Beyond that, she can't write about things before her time because she's fundamentally incurious about them and doesn't want to do any work. So one wonders if the only reason the Fantastic Beasts movie were made was because she thought writing a screenplay would be far easier than writing a novel and require less work from her. If that's what she imagined, she was dead wrong. But I can't really speculate much on that because beyond what I've gleaned from the rest of her words and actions, I don't know. And yet, having said all of that I've said so far, there's still one thing that's really worth mentioning about why her follow-ups and additions have failed. She's just not very interested in writing good stories. Now, what I mean by that is when she was writing Harry Potter, she needed money, and she had every reason to try extremely hard to write something good. And when it blew up, she made bank. And now, she's set for life. The money she makes on licensing and the various properties associated with her original works means that if she doesn't want to, she never needs to write another story again. And since she doesn't need to write, she can focus on what she really cares about, which is settling scores and starting fights with people on Twitter, venting her spleen to the world about how much she hates the world that she lives in because it doesn't conform to her ideas of how it should be. So a creator with nothing to say and no vision beyond petty sniping at people they don't like can't make something like Harry Potter. The Rowling of 1991 absolutely could write Harry Potter. The Rowling of 2022 is absolutely incapable of writing Harry Potter. They are fundamentally different people at different points in their lives, and assuming that just because she could do it before, she can do it again obscures why she managed to do it the first time. Honestly, it may be better for everyone if she just let other people take over the way Batman has dozens of writers. Now, I don't think that's going to happen because she's a control freak, but it might be better for everyone in the long run if that's what she did.